Imagine waking up in the year 1347. The air is cold, the sky the color of dishwater, and your breath curls in front of you like steam from an overboiled cauldron. You're not a knight, not a monk, not even a farmer. You're something far stranger by medieval standards. You're a doctor. At least, that's what people call you: leech, physician, healer. The titles sound impressive, but you don't have degrees or diplomas. You have stains. On your hands, on your robe, on your conscience. You rise from your straw mattress and immediately regret it. The smell in your little room is a mixture of vinegar, sweat, candle smoke, and garlic, the last one clinging to everything you own. You didn't cook with it. You boiled it, crushed it, hung it in bundles from the rafters. Garlic in your time isn't food, it's armor. Because in the Middle Ages, people believed smells are dangerous, odor is infection, stench is sin. If the air around you smells foul, it isn't just unpleasant, it's deadly. The same invisible miasma that makes a corpse reek could crawl into your lungs and rot you from the inside. That's what they tell you at the university anyway. So you wrap your face in a linen cloth soaked in herbs, light a candle, and hope the smoke will chase away whatever unseen horrors drift through the streets. Somewhere outside, a cart rolls past, carrying the moans of the sick toward the monastery infirmary. You can smell them before you see them. You grab your satchel. Inside, your instruments clink together like guilty secrets: iron hooks, dull scalpels, leeches floating in a glass jar, and a tiny pouch of crushed garlic. That last one makes you hesitate. Garlic is supposed to protect against bad air, but lately some priests have started calling it dangerous, too strong, too foreign, too close to witchcraft. Still, you bring it. Better the smell of sin than the taste of death. Outside, the world is damp and gray. The narrow streets of the town are alive in the wrong way, buzzing with flies, slick with filth. Waste runs through the gutters, the color of everything you don't want to imagine. People cross themselves as you pass, as though your presence alone might draw sickness. And in a way, it might. Doctors in this age are like moths to a lantern. They flutter toward disease and often die in its glow. Your first patient today is a baker. He's pale, sweating, and insists he's been cursed by his neighbor's goat. You check his pulse, which means you press 2 fingers to his wrist and pretend to understand what the rhythm means. Too fast? Too slow? Either way, you nod solemnly. A good doctor always looks certain even when he isn't. You pull out your pouch of garlic, crush it, mix it with wine and a little honey, then smear it on a cloth and lay it across the man's chest. He groans at the smell. His wife glares at you from the corner. Garlic to them smells like poverty, like the kitchens of peasants and the breath of thieves. Noble patients prefer roses, lavender, or frankincense. Garlic is what the poor use when they can't afford hope. But you don't care. You've seen worse than disapproval. You've seen fevers that burn through entire families, boils that sing hymns in the language of pus, and children whose skin turns black beneath their mother's tears. Garlic may stink, but at least it pretends to help. You wait. The baker breathes shallowly. You say a prayer under your breath, not because you believe it will cure him, but because you don't want to be accused of not believing. In your world, skepticism is heresy, and heresy is contagious. When the patient finally drifts into uneasy sleep, you step outside for air. The sky has darkened, the bell of St. Gertrude's is tolling, you can taste the iron of smoke on your tongue. Someone nearby is burning herbs, sage, rosemary, wormwood, each believed to purify the air, but nothing can purify the fear. A group of women hurries past, each with a small bundle of garlic tied to her belt. You catch their whispers. "The plague is coming," one says. "They say it rides on the wind." Another shakes her head. "No, It's punishment. Garlic won't stop God's wrath. You turn away, pretending not to hear. You've heard this debate too many times. The university says disease is natural imbalance. The church says it's divine justice. The peasants say it's witchcraft. And you're caught between them all, clinging to your little pouch of garlic like a relic of reason. In the next house, a child lies feverish beneath a rough wool blanket. Her mother kneels beside her, whispering the same prayer over and over, her lips cracked from fasting. You reach for your leeches. The woman hesitates. Will it hurt her? She asks. You give the same answer every doctor gives, not as much as dying. The leeches cling, the girl whimpers. You add a smear of crushed garlic to her feet. Folk wisdom says it draws out the evil humors through the skin. The mother wrinkles her nose. That smell? It's the devil's root, she mutters. You almost laugh. If the devil had a root, you think it would smell better than this. Outside again, the street is crowded. A merchant is shouting about vinegar charms. A friar preaches repentance from atop a cart. The air is thick with incense and sweat. Everyone's afraid of breathing. Even the dogs look anxious. You make your way to the apothecary's stall, a dark little nook lined with jars labeled in Latin no one can read properly. The apothecary himself, a man who looks older than the church, greets you with a crooked grin. Garlic again, he asks. You doctors never learn. You raise an eyebrow. You'd rather I use prayers? He shrugs. Prayers don't smell like goats. You buy what you came for anyway. Dried bulbs, brittle and pale. They cost less than saffron, but more than common sense. You crush one in your hand. The scent fills the air, sharp and stubborn. Some nearby women recoil. One crosses herself. Keep that stench away, she says. My cousin used it last winter, and she died before Easter. You want to say that maybe she didn't die because of garlic, but you've learned that logic doesn't sell well in times of fear. You tuck the clothes into your satchel and move on. The hospital, or what passes for one, is a converted chapel. The smell hits before the sight. Sweat, mold, rot, and vinegar. Rows of straw pallets line the stone floor, each holding a body that's either dying or practicing for it. You move among them, a small island of supposed knowledge in a sea of suffering. You examine a man whose neck is swollen like a wineskin. Bubzos, they call them. You've seen this before, and you know how it ends. You light a candle, crush some garlic, and rub it over your mask's nosepiece. You do it not because it works, but because it gives you something to do. The scent cuts through the reek of death. It's almost comforting, almost. The other doctors whisper that garlic offends the angels, that its sharpness drives away not just sickness, but holiness. You don't know if you believe that. You've never seen an angel stay long enough to ask. A monk approaches, his habit stained with more sins than prayers. You should rely on faith, he tells you, not peasant charms. You nod politely. Faith doesn't disinfect wounds, you say. He frowns, as if you've insulted the Virgin herself. Faith disinfects the soul. You don't argue, you just keep working, crushing cloves between your fingers until your hands sting. You smear the paste on linen, press it to the dying man's skin, and whisper something halfway between a blessing and a lie. You'll feel better soon. Hours pass, the candles burn low. One by one, the patients drift into silence. Some sleep, some don't. You wash your hands in vinegar, rub them dry, and stare at the faint green stains where the garlic juice has bitten into your skin. You wonder if the others are right, if the plant itself carries something unholy. Maybe the church fears it not because it smells bad, but because it works too well. Garlic doesn't need prayers. It doesn't kneel. It simply exists, stubborn and alive, like a peasant who refuses to die quietly. When you step outside, the night is heavy with mist. The moon hides behind clouds, pale as bone. From the tavern, laughter echoes, loud, desperate, human. You almost go in, but you smell yourself first and decide against it. Your cloak reeks of garlic and smoke and everything unholy. People will move away from you on instinct. The irony isn't lost on you. You spend your life fighting death, and still, no one wants to stand too close. You walk home through narrow alleys, past the butcher's shop, the tanner's pit, the silent church. A rat scurries over your boot, pauses, and vanishes. You catch your reflection in a puddle. A tired man in tattered robes, carrying the scent of salvation and sin in equal measure. Somewhere in the dark, a woman screams. You don't stop. You can't. You've learned that in this world, sickness doesn't chase you, it waits. And you'll meet it again tomorrow, armed with nothing but superstition, vinegar, and the same humble clove of garlic everyone else fears. You reach your door, bolt it, and light a candle. The flame flickers, throwing shadows that look like specters on the wall. You crush one last clove, smear it near the window to ward off the miasma, and crawl back into your straw bed. The smell follows you, sharp, earthy, alive. You close your eyes and think about how absurd it is, how something meant to keep death away has become the very reason people avoid you. You smile just slightly. Then the smile fades. Outside, the bell tolls again. Another soul gone. Another lesson learned too late. You breathe in the smell of garlic and ash. It stings your throat. It smells like fear disguised as medicine. Like hope pretending to be knowledge, like everything else in the Middle Ages. And when you finally drift toward sleep, you dream not of angels or salvation, but of something simpler: fresh air, clean water, and a world where a doctor isn't afraid of a plant. You wake before dawn again. The candle has guttered out sometime in the night, leaving a thin trail of smoke that still curls toward the ceiling. Outside, the town is quiet in that uneasy way that always precedes a storm or a funeral. You can hear the faint scrape of a broom, someone sweeping filth from one doorway to another. Progress in its medieval form. You sit up slowly. Your throat burns from the smoke, or maybe the garlic. Your hands ache from yesterday's work. The knuckles cracked open by the cold, the nails dark with herbs and ash. You flex your fingers and they make a sound like parchment being folded. Another day of healing begins, which mostly means another day of trying not to die. You wrap your cloak around your shoulders, stiff from dried vinegar, and prepare the same small ritual you've done 100 times. First, a linen mask soaked in wine and rosemary. Then a pinch of garlic tucked beneath the cloth, so close to your nose that every breath stings. The other doctors mock you for it. The garlic man, they call you, as if your breath alone could raise the dead. Maybe it could. Still, you wear it, because superstition or not, there's comfort in routine. You crush another clove for your pocket. You hang one over the doorway. You mutter the old Latin charm you learned in Salerno: Fag mala, fag morbum. Flee evil, flee disease. The words sound powerful until you remember no one ever fled fast enough. The streets are waking. Smoke rises from crooked chimneys, heavy and blue. The butcher drags a carcass out onto his table, humming a hymn that doesn't belong anywhere near blood. A woman empties a chamber pot into the gutter, shouts "Gardyloo," and ducks back inside before the splash lands. You pass a tavern where a group of men are already drinking. They look up when they see you, the healer, the one with the smell. One of them spits into the dirt and mutters something about witchcraft. You ignore it. You've learned that arguing with fear only feeds it. Your next patient is a priest. That's always dangerous. The church trusts you just enough to keep you alive and distrusts you just enough to make sure you never get comfortable. The priest lies pale in his bed, sweating through his linen sheets. mumbling half a prayer. He claims the fever is divine punishment, but he still called for you. Divine punishment is one thing, dying of it is another. You grind garlic into a paste with honey and vinegar, the smell filling the tiny room until your eyes water. The priest flinches. Must it be that, he asks? You nod. It draws out corruption? He frowns. Or invites it. You don't reply. You just keep working, pressing the mixture onto his chest with steady hands. He mutters a psalm, louder now, as if the words could disinfect the air between you. For a moment, you think he might strike your hand away, but then his strength gives out. When you leave, his apprentice follows you to the door. He says garlic offends the angels, the boy whispers. You pause. Then perhaps the angels should learn medicine. The boy's eyes widen, and you know you've said too much. Words like that can travel faster than plague. Outside, you breathe in the cold air, sharp with wood smoke and the distant tang of iron. You walk toward the river, where washerwomen beat linen against stones, their laughter rising above the splash. They gossip between strikes. One glances at you and lowers her voice. You hear your own name, then the word garlic, then laughter. You don't bother asking what they said. You already know. Garlic makes you a curiosity, too strong for polite company, too strange for the faithful, too poor for the nobles who prefer rose oil and frankincense. You've tried those too, the expensive perfumes of trust, but they never seem to do much except make death smell better. At the infirmary, the other physicians are already arguing. One swears by crushed emeralds mixed with milk, another insists that chanting the Agnus Dei over leeches makes them work faster. You set down your bag. Or, you say quietly, we could wash our hands. They stare at you like you've suggested cannibalism. Washing weakens the skin, one of them says. It opens the pores. Everyone knows that. You don't argue. You've done enough of that for one lifetime. You simply sit, unwrap your herbs, and begin sorting them on the table. Thyme, sage, wormwood, and garlic. Always garlic. The smell fills the room, and someone opens a window. By midday, the infirmary has become a slow-moving tragedy. The moans of the dying rise and fall like a broken chant. You work in silence, applying poultices, draining boils, whispering reassurances you don't believe. A woman grips your wrist and pleads, "You'll make him better, won't you?" You look at the man on the pallet, gray skin, glassy eyes, breath rattling like a dying bellows, and say, "I'll try." It's the only word medicine truly owns. Try. Between patients, you find yourself staring at the jars on the shelves, leeches, powders, tinctures, dried roots, and one cloudy flask that may or may not still contain wine. Every cure is a gamble. Garlic, vinegar, bleeding, prayer, you do them all, because doing nothing feels like heresy. Late in the day, you visit the plague house on the edge of town. It's little more than a barn with a cross painted in ash on the door. Inside, the air is heavy and still, the kind of air that feels like it's watching you. The caretaker meets you at the entrance. His face is wrapped in cloth, his eyes red from smoke. "Don't bring garlic," he says. "The smell drives them mad." You hesitate. The sick, the dying. You step inside anyway. The floor creaks underfoot. Figures lie under blankets, their shapes barely human. You kneel beside one, a young man, maybe 18, his lips blackened, his breath a whisper. You open your satchel, but your hands stop. The smell here is worse than anything garlic could mask. You look at the boy's face. He's beyond herbs, beyond words. All you can do is sit, hold his hand, and hope your presence counts for something. Outside, after too many hours, you wash your hands in a basin of vinegar. The water clouds red. The caretaker watches. "They say doctors carry the smell of death," he mutters. You dry your hands. Doctors carry the smell of what they fight, He looks away, and sometimes they carry it home. That night, as you walk back through the town, you notice something new. The people are wearing garlands, not of flowers, but of garlic, hung around necks, tied to wrists, tucked into belts. The same plant that made them sneer at you now hangs like a talisman from every door. You should feel vindicated, but instead you feel tired. Because you know what that means. The sickness is here. You pass the church square. A priest is burning incense in a swinging censer, his voice trembling through the evening prayer. Lord, spare us from the pestilence. The crowd echoes him, clutching their cloves of garlic like rosaries. You stop for a moment, watching the smoke rise. It mingles with the fog, with the stench, with the garlic, a strange, bitter perfume that belongs only to this century. Fear, faith, and fermentation. You make your way home. The door creaks when you push it open. Inside, the air is thick with the same smell you can't escape. You set your satchel down, light a candle, and stare at the flickering flame. You crush one last clove and rub it between your fingers. The juice burns. The scent fills the room until your eyes sting. Somewhere in that smell, sharp, earthy, almost metallic, you think you can hear something whispering beneath it. Not superstition, not science, just survival. You understand now why medieval doctors were afraid of garlic. Not because of its strength or its smell or its heretical reputation, but because every time they reached for it, they were admitting a terrible truth, that they didn't really know what they were fighting. You sit for a long while at that candlelit table, listening to the faint hiss of the flame. The room smells of smoke and garlic, the perfume of your profession. Outside, the town murmurs in its sleep. Somewhere a baby cries, somewhere else a bell tolls. The world is never quiet here. You think of what the priest said, that garlic offends the angels and it won't leave your mind. You've heard it from others too, whispered in confessionals and marketplaces, that the devil himself walks with the scent of garlic on his breath. It makes no sense, but neither does most of what keeps people alive. The idea began, you recall, with the scholars, the learned men who filled their manuscripts with theories about purity and smell. They said the body's odors revealed the soul's condition. Fragrant people were virtuous, foul ones were corrupt. The sweet scent of lilies was holiness. The musk of sweat was sin. And garlic, pungent, earthy, peasant, was the smell of flesh ungoverned. You remember an old lecture in Salerno, your teacher pacing in his black robe, voice echoing off the stone. Odor reveals essence, he said. The righteous smell of roses, the wicked of sulfur. Someone asked, and garlic? He frowned. Garlic lies between, useful to heal, dangerous to overuse. It belongs to those who live too near the soil. Everyone laughed, except you. Even then, you knew most of the world lived near the soil. The churchmen took that notion and ran with it. They began to speak of breath as proof of sin. To smell of garlic was to smell of appetite, of hunger, of the body refusing to stay pious. Monks banned it from their meals. Nuns refused to grow it in convent gardens. In sermons, preachers warned that the clove was the devil's lure, making men lustful and women bold. You had seen the pamphlets, crude drawings of Eve handing Adam not an apple, but a bulb of garlic. And yet, when plague came, even the pious reached for it. They hung it over altars, burned it with incense, chewed it until their mouths blistered. Faith bends quickly when death breathes near. You remember the day a bishop summoned you. His palace smelled of beeswax and roses, the air thick with expensive virtue. He lay pale on a velvet bed, clutching his chest. You approached with your bag, and his attendants wrinkled their noses before you even opened it. "Not that stinkin' herb," he rasped. "You'll not bring it into this chamber. You bowed. My lord, it drives out the bad airs. It drives out good company, he said, half smiling, half dying. So you gave him rose water instead. Useless but polite, he recovered just enough to call it a miracle. You left the palace poorer but wiser. In this world, survival depends as much on smell as on skill. Over the years, the superstition grew teeth. Midwives who used garlic for childbirth were accused of summoning spirits. Apothecaries who sold too much of it were said to poison the faithful. You saw one burned for mixing it into holy oil. A mistake of chemistry turned into a charge of blasphemy. And yet, you keep using it, because for all the fear and the sermons, you've seen garlic do what prayer alone never could. It cleans wounds. It drives away flies. It gives a dying man one more night to breathe. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe grace. In your time, those words mean almost the same thing. You rise and walk to the window. The fog has thickened, turning the street into a ghost of itself. A shape moves below a woman carrying a basket. She glances up, sees your shadow, and makes the sign of the cross. You can't tell if she's blessing you or protecting herself from you. You lean against the sill, the cold seeping through the stone. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crows, stubbornly announcing another morning. You whisper to yourself, half amused, half weary, maybe the angels aren't afraid of garlic. Maybe it's the doctors they fear. The candle sputters, the flame shrinking to a tiny red heart. You press the last clove between your palms until the juice stings your skin. The smell lingers, sharp, human, unholy, and real. The world outside still believes garlic is wicked, but for now, in this small room, it smells like courage. You stay by the window a long time, watching the fog roll through the alley like breath from some sleeping giant. The candle dies to a thin line of smoke, the room sinking into shadow. You can hear the faint drip of water from the eaves, the hush of a world trying to survive itself. You sit down again and look at your hands stained green at the fingertips, the smell of garlic clinging like memory. You think of all the people who have cursed this scent, all the sermons that called it wicked, all the patients who flinched when you crushed a clove beside their bed. And yet here it is, still growing, still defying fear, still alive in the earth when so much else rots. You smile faintly at the thought. Maybe that's why people fear it. Garlic doesn't obey. It refuses to bow, to sweeten, to hide its nature. In a world ruled by purity and prayer, that's enough to make anything dangerous. The bell tolls again outside. One slow note rolling over the rooftops. You close your eyes, let the sound fade, and breathe in the scent that everyone else avoids. It stings, but it steadies you. Tomorrow, there will be more patience, more prayers, more fear, and still, the same small clove crushed between your palms, the same question haunting you with every breath, is this healing or heresy? You exhale softly and let the night take you. The garlic burns faintly in the air, a promise and a warning both. Somewhere, far to the south, another physician is making the same gamble, but his story will end very differently. Hay say that in the 12th century, in the city of Salerno, there lived a man who smelled perpetually of garlic and heresy. His name was Theodore. Physician, scholar, cautious believer, reluctant sinner. Salerno, in his day, was not just a city, it was an idea, a gleaming exception in a Europe still stumbling through superstition. Here, the great Schola Medica Salernitana, the first true medical school of the Western world, stood perched above the sea like a cathedral of reason. Men and women alike came from distant kingdoms to learn how the body worked, how herbs healed, and how much ignorance could cost. Theodore had been one of its brightest students. He'd memorized the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a book of wisdom written in careful Latin verse. If you seek health, flee anger and gluttony, bathe often, and breathe clean air. It was poetic, practical, and mostly useless in a city that smelled of fish, incense, and sweat. He studied under masters who quoted Galen as if he were scripture. They spoke of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and of how balance was life and imbalance was death. But Theodore, like many bright men before him, began to notice the pattern no one wanted to see. People bled, purged, prayed, and still died. That was when he began to experiment. Not openly, quietly, in the small hours of the night when the monastery bells slept. He brewed tinctures of vinegar and honey. He crushed onions, mustard seeds, and garlic into pastes. And though the stench lingered on his hands for days, he noticed something miraculous. His patients didn't rot as quickly. Garlic, that humble root despised by nobles, seemed to keep wounds from festering. He wrote it down in the margins of his notes. Alium fortem est cibus contra corruptionem. Garlic is strong, food against decay. But the world he lived in was not kind to men who trusted what they saw over what they were told. Theodore's life changed one winter, when a merchant arrived from Sicily, feverish and swollen with plague. The city locked its gates, prayers thundered from the cathedral, and the sick were herded into quarantine outside the walls. Theodore went with them. He had no family, only his books and his instincts, and his bag of garlic. He crushed it with vinegar, soaked bandages in it, pressed them to the boo-boos of the sick. The smell made the priests gag. But some of the patients lived. Not all, not even most, but enough to notice. Word spread. Theodore's tent became known as Domus Auli, the House of Garlic. And soon, as with all things in medieval Europe, curiosity turned to suspicion. People began to whisper that the smell of his remedies masked something darker, that he didn't pray over his herbs, that the devil whispered formulas in his dreams, that the garlic, sharp and unholy, was his pact made visible. A friar was sent to investigate. He entered the tent one morning, clutching a crucifix, as if the garlic fumes might bite. Theodore offered him a clove. "Taste it," he said. "If it is evil, you will know." The friar refused. Only sinners eat from the soil of corruption. Theodore smiled thinly. "Then the world must be full of sinners, Father, for everything grows from soil." That night the friar reported to the bishop that Theodore's eyes glowed like coals. In truth, they only reflected the candlelight. But superstition never needed proof. Weeks passed. The plague ebbed, but the fear stayed. People avoided the House of Garlic. Children crossed themselves when Theodore passed. His name began appearing in sermons. Never directly, but close enough. The bishop summoned him at last. The meeting took place in a chamber that smelled of beeswax and roses. Theodore bowed. "My lord bishop," he began, "you called for me." The bishop nodded, his voice smooth as oil. "You treat the sick without proper rites. You make use of unclean things." Theodore clasped his hands. "I use what works." The bishop's eyes narrowed. "Garlic? Yes. It cleans wounds and offends heaven. Does heaven faint at its smell?" Theodore asked softly. The bishop's mouth twitched. "You speak as though God were a patient of yours." "If he were," Theodore said, "I would still use garlic." It was the wrong answer. The bishop dismissed him with a motion of the hand. By nightfall, Theodore's tent had been burned. He left Salerno before dawn, walking south along the cliffs where the air smelled of salt and ash. Behind him, the school continued to teach Galen's humors, and the church continued to bless its failures. He settled in a fishing village, tending to peasants who had no use for theology. They paid him in bread, fish, and silence. There, Theodore grew older. His beard silvered, his reputation faded into rumor. He still worked by candlelight, crushing garlic and murmuring his half-prayers. He treated fishermen's wounds, childbirth fevers, infections from the sea. And again, he watched garlic do what the learned men said it could not. When he died, sometime around Wothain 89, the villagers buried him near the cliffs. They covered his grave with wild garlic, believing it would keep his spirit from wandering. The church refused him burial in consecrated ground, but the villagers said that at night, when the wind came from the sea, the air smelled faintly of his cures. Centuries later, physicians in Italy would rediscover the antibacterial power of garlic and call it scientific progress. They would speak of compounds in chemistry, not demons or sin. But somewhere in that long lineage of learning, a faint scent would linger, something earthy, persistent, alive. Theodore's ghost, perhaps. Or maybe just the echo of one stubborn man who trusted the evidence of his hands more than the comfort of his prayers. Because long before laboratories and microscopes, before words like infection or antibiotic, there was only a man, a clove, and the quiet courage to smell wrong in a world that worshipped the right perfume. And if you walk the cliffs of Salerno on a damp spring evening, when the wind blows in from the sea and the wild garlic blooms along the stones, the scent still rises faintly through the mist, sharp, clean, and unrepentant. Some would say it smells like medicine. Others would say it smells like blasphemy. But to Theodore, it smelled like truth. You can imagine the silence that followed Theodore's disappearance. No public trial, no excommunication, just absence. In medieval Europe, that was often how heresy died. Not in fire, but in rumor. For a while, Salerno pretended he had never existed. His name vanished from the rolls. His notes were confiscated and stored in the school's cellar, beneath the anatomy hall where scholars studied the dead. A faint trace of garlic still clung to the pages. It was said that even the archivists avoided touching them for fear of smelling like sin. But ideas, like scents, are stubborn things. They linger. They travel. Some of Theodore's students had copied his experiments in secret, small details written in the margins of recipe books hidden between prayers to Saint Roche, the patron of plague victims. Allium heals where oil fails. Crush with vinegar. Apply to rot. Little notes like fragments of a forgotten gospel. When the next wave of plague reached southern Italy, the physicians remembered those margins. They remembered the smell of Theodore's tent. And desperate men, even pious ones, are practical. They used his methods quietly, in the basements of monasteries and the back rooms of apothecaries. They crushed garlic into poultices, burned it in sick rooms, hung it from door frames. And again, though none would admit it publicly, the sick sometimes lived. The church began to notice. By the late 12th century, medical texts were being translated from Arabic into Latin, flowing through Salerno and Montpellier like a new tide of reason. But among the pages of wisdom from Galen and Avicenna, bishops found something unsettling. Repeated references to garlic, written in the same cramped script. It was Theodore's handwriting. The investigation that followed was less about medicine and more about control. At its heart was a fear older than plague, the fear that healing might exist outside holiness. A council of scholars and clerics gathered in Salerno's great hall, the sea glinting through its arched windows. They spoke for hours in careful Latin, weighing sin against science, scent against salvation. Some argued that garlic was a gift of God, grown from the same earth that produced wheat and wine. Others said it was born of corruption, a plant that thrived in dung and shadows, that stank of decay. A friar even cited the Book of Numbers, claiming that when the Israelites longed for garlic in the desert, they were longing for Egypt for bondage and sin. By the end of the council, the verdict was cautious but clear. Garlic was not to be banned, but it was not to be trusted. Doctors could use it, but sparingly, and never in sacred spaces. No garlic near the altar. No garlic in hospitals, blessed by the church. A rule born from compromise and fear, written down in parchment that smelled faintly of cloves and ink. It was Theodore's victory and condemnation at once. For centuries after, the superstition hardened. In monasteries, monks who brewed medicines were told to wash their hands in rose water before prayer, lest the odor of garlic offend the angels. In noble courts, physicians sprinkled their robes with perfume before visiting patients, masking the scent of their own tools. Garlic became the smell of low medicine, of back-alley healers, of women who practiced folk remedies, of peasants who trusted what grew underfoot. By the 13th century, garlic was quietly excluded from the official Antidotorium Nicolai, the grand pharmaceutical text compiled in Salerno itself. The same city that once celebrated Theodore now pretended it had invented cleanliness instead of caution. Still, the stories persisted. Fishermen whispered that on stormy nights, a pale figure walked the cliffs carrying a lantern that smelled faintly of garlic and vinegar. They said he appeared only when plague was near, as if the earth itself exhaled his warning. No one admitted to believing it, but mothers began tucking cloves beneath their children's pillows. Priests blessed them in secret. The irony, if anyone noticed it, stayed unspoken. In time, Theodore became a kind of ghost in the margins of medicine. Not saint, not sinner, just a reminder of the price of being right too soon. When later physicians rediscovered the healing properties of garlic, they called it progress. When monks finally wrote about cleansing vapors in herbs, they called it revelation. No one mentioned the man who'd been chased from Salerno for saying the same thing centuries earlier. But the truth has a strange way of fermenting. It waits, buried under ash and superstition, until the air changes. And then, when someone dares to crush a clove again, it releases the same smell. Sharp, ancient, undeniable. So if you ever walk into an old Italian apothecary and catch that faint sting of garlic beneath the sweeter notes of rose and lavender, remember, you're not just smelling a herb. You're smelling defiance. Theodore's kind of defiance. The kind that refuses to stay buried. And somewhere, if history has a sense of humor, the old doctor of Salerno is smiling faintly, triumphantly, in the dark. You can almost picture how the legends began, quietly, in candlelight, whispered more for comfort than belief. Theodore's name became a story parents told when the air turned thick and fever crept back into the villages. They said that sometimes, when pestilence returned to the coast, a doctor in a tattered robe would appear at the edge of the fields. He never spoke. He only left a small bundle of garlic on the doorstep, tied with twine. By morning, the sick inside the house would still be breathing. It was never proven, but proof was never the point. The fisherman in Amalfi said his ghost walked the cliffs during storms, a dim lantern swinging in his hand, the air around him sharp with garlic and sea wind. "He's warning us," they'd mutter, telling us when to stay ashore. The priests disapproved, of course, but when a storm rose suddenly and a boat returned safely, someone would always leave a clove on the chapel steps. In the mountain villages inland, the story changed. There, Theodore became the garlic saint, a figure the church never canonized, but the people quietly prayed to anyway. His image was painted not in stained glass, but scratched into door lintels, a thin man with a bundle of herbs in one hand and a candle in the other. His blessing was crude but heartfelt. May the air not turn against you. Over time, even the church softened toward him. By the 14th century, when plague swept through again, bishops who once banned garlic now hung it from cathedral gates. Symbolic, they said, as though symbols couldn't save them. They burned incense laced with herbs, blessed vinegar, and rediscovered the old Salernitan recipes, the same ones Theodore had written. But superstition dies harder than disease. While garlic returned to the medicine chest, Theodore's name remained uneasy. His notes were cited anonymously, from the writings of an unnamed physician of Salerno. The same anonymity that once saved him from burning, now erased him from memory. In some corners of Italy, though, the legend persisted in stranger forms. In one small convent near Bari, nuns told of a possession, a young novice who shrieked and convulsed during prayer. The priest tried exorcism, fasting, relics, nothing worked. Then, an old apothecary's wife suggested a clove of garlic tied around the girl's wrist. The priest protested, but desperation won. They tried it. The girl slept through the night. The next morning, the priest declared it a miracle. The bishop declared it coincidence. The apothecary's wife simply said he was right about the smell. No one spoke Theodore's name, but everyone knew who he was. Centuries passed, and medicine changed its clothes. Physicians traded robes for coats, prayers for microscopes. They discovered bacteria, infection, antisepsis, and began to understand that maybe, just maybe, the world had always been filled with invisible things that could kill you. And when they studied the properties of garlic, the sulfuric compounds, the antimicrobial oils, they published papers and claimed discovery. But to anyone who remembered the old stories, it wasn't new knowledge at all. It was Theodore, vindicated through time and chemistry. Even now, in the old quarter of Salerno, there's a narrow lane that smells faintly of the sea and of something sharper. The locals call it Vicolo dell'Alio, Garlic Alley. If you walk it late at night, when the wind rises from the harbor and the stones sweat with salt, you might feel it, that thin sting of the herb he once crushed between his palms. Tour guides will tell you it's the kitchens. Historians will tell you it's myth. But the old women who hang garlic from their windows will just smile and say, he still walks there when the air is bad. And maybe they're right, because legends have a way of haunting the places where truth was once silenced. Theodore of Salerno never became a saint, but he became something rarer, a rumor that endured. A man who proved that sometimes what saves us isn't purity or prayer, but the courage to smell like the truth when everyone else demands roses. The wind over Salerno always carried a scent. Some nights it was the sea, soft and briny, brushing the cliffs with salt. Other nights it was something stranger, a faint, biting trace of garlic drifting through the narrow streets, as if the city itself remembered. The townspeople no longer spoke Theodore's name, but they still followed his rituals without knowing why. Garlic over the doorway, when the air felt heavy. Vinegar wiped on the sill before the rains. A clove tucked in the pocket of a child traveling alone. Little acts of superstition passed down as instinct, surviving long after their reasons faded. The church, of course, moved on. The bishops who once burned his notes were buried in marble tombs that still smelled faintly of incense and damp stone. Their names carved deep, their certainties forgotten. But Theodore, nameless in the records, faceless in the frescoes, lingered where memory lives longest, in rumor and in scent. Every few years, when the harvest turned black or the air thickened with sickness, someone would notice it again, that sharp, honest smell carried on the wind, reminding them that fear and healing were often the same thing, just inhaled differently. Theodore of Salerno was gone, but his defiance endured in every kitchen, every garden, every bundle of cloves hung against the dark. He had outlasted the scholars, the bishops, the centuries, and so the story ends as quietly as he lived. A man who found light in decay and truth in a root that refused to be holy. Tonight, the old city sleeps. The waves slap against the harbor wall. Somewhere, a candle flickers beside a patient's bed. and through the open window drifts that same ancient smell, sharp, human, alive. It no longer means sin. It means survival. Imagine standing in a medieval street at dusk. The air is heavy with smoke and the smell of tallow candles. Someone nearby is boiling onions, another burning rosemary to ward off evil vapors. And above it all, floating through the fog, comes the faint, unmistakable scent of garlic. You cover your nose instinctively. Everyone does. It's the smell of sickness, the smell of fear. In the 14th century, disease isn't just a part of life. It is life. It lurks in the water, hides in the dust, clings to the sleeves of merchants and the prayers of priests. People die suddenly, cruelly, and always without explanation. And when that happens often enough, logic isn't comfort. Faith is. Doctors walk a narrow bridge between the two. Too pious, and they're dismissed as superstitious. Too practical, and they're accused of witchcraft. Somewhere in the middle lies the profession. Half alchemy, half apology. They carry tools that look more like torture devices. Saws, knives, and bloodletting bowls engraved with prayers. They recite psalms while cutting veins, muttering in Latin not because it helps, but because it sounds official. And when a patient dies, as most do, they whisper, "It was God's will," and wash their hands in vinegar that smells faintly of garlic and regret. The logic of medicine in these centuries rests on invisible patterns. If a fever burns, it's excess blood. If you cough, it's too much phlegm. If you despair, it's an imbalance of black bile, or maybe just the Middle Ages. No microscopes, no bacteria, no understanding of what's actually happening, just faith in theories written 1,000 years earlier by men who guessed elegantly. And always, behind the theory, the smell. The medieval world was obsessed with odor. The body's scent revealed the soul's health. Good people smelled sweet. Sinners smelled foul. That wasn't poetry, that was policy. Cities passed laws against offensive smells. Street cleaners shoveled manure, not for hygiene, but for morality. Even doctors ranked diseases by how they stank. A mild cough was the damp humor. The plague was the corruption of air. And garlic, strong, sharp, unapologetic, was caught in the middle. It was both medicine and menace. Doctors used it to mask infection, to drive away miasma, to rub under their nostrils before visiting plague houses. But to everyone else, that smell meant danger was near. If you reeked of garlic, it wasn't because you were sick. It was because you'd been close enough to the sick to carry their scent. Soon, the fear spread faster than the disease. People stopped opening their doors to healers. They stuffed posies in their sleeves, wore pomanders filled with herbs, held oranges spiked with cloves to their noses. Anything to drown out the world's decay. Because in this age, what kills you isn't invisible. It's odor. Plague was the perfect teacher. It reminded everyone how fragile the boundary between breath and death really was. Cities emptied overnight. Bells tolled constantly until even grief lost rhythm. And yet, amid the chaos, physicians still wrote careful treatises about air correction. They advised lighting fires in the streets to burn away bad vapors, fumigating rooms with vinegar, or, if desperate, boiling garlic and hanging the steam-soaked cloth at the window. No one truly believed it worked, but it was something to do. And in a world collapsing around you, doing something was the only way to feel human. Faith offered its own cures. Priests paraded relics through the streets, bones of saints, drops of holy water, the occasional finger of someone important. Monks carried crosses and chanted litanies until their voices cracked. They told the faithful that plague was not infection, but judgment, that each cough was a reminder of sin. And so the sick begged forgiveness instead of medicine. Doctors hated it. They were supposed to be men of reason, trained in the logic of humors. But even they prayed before opening a vein. Because when you've watched entire families turn black, and still, reason starts to sound like arrogance. So they bled, burned, and bathed in superstition. They rubbed garlic on the skin not just to heal, but to smell, protect it. They hung herbs over their beds like rosaries made of plants. And when those failed, which they usually did, they confessed, fasted, and started again. In the Middle Ages, medicine and faith weren't opposites. They were roommates, arguing in the dark. At night, the cities glowed with candlelight and smoke. The air trembled with chanting and coughing. Families sealed their homes with wax, as if walls could keep out wrath. And the doctors, those strange, tragic figures in long robes, wandered between houses like ghosts, reeking of vinegar and garlic, the scent of both salvation and death. Some wore the beaked masks you've seen in paintings, stuffed with herbs, designed to filter air. Inside the beak, they placed lavender, camphor, and always garlic. The mask wasn't just armor against disease. It was a confession of fear, a way of saying, we don't understand this world, but we will not breathe it raw. Imagine their nights. The streets empty, but for dogs and the slow wheels of death carts. The torchlight trembling against wet stone. The sound of someone weeping in a nearby window. And the doctor, walking alone through that fog of rot and incense, clutching a bundle of garlic like a prayer he could hold. You can almost feel the logic that guided them. If smell carries sickness, then a stronger smell must drive it away. If air can kill, then air can also cure. And so the world filled itself with perfumes, smoke, and hope, disguised as scent. Even the church joined in. Priests burned sulfur, myrrh, and juniper in the aisles until the cathedrals smelled like medicine cabinets. Confessionals reeked of vinegar. The incense grew sharper, harsher, more medicinal. Faith itself began to smell of antiseptic. And in that haze of holy smoke, the two worlds, plague and prayer, merged completely. The doctors and the priests became indistinguishable silhouettes in the fog, both doing the same thing in different languages, trying to make the air safe. It's easy, centuries later, to laugh at their fear. We know about bacteria, contagion, hygiene. We have masks and medicine and microscopes. Will nix. But fear never really changes shape. It only changes its name. The medieval doctor was terrified of breathing the wrong air. You are terrified of touching the wrong surface, standing too close, hearing the wrong cough. Different science, same heartbeat. And maybe that's why garlic still lingers. Because beneath all the prayers, beneath all the theories, it offered something the others didn't: immediacy. You could smell it. You could hold it. It was tangible protection in a world where God and death were equally invisible. So when medieval doctors flinched at its strength, they weren't really afraid of garlic. They were afraid of what it represented. That healing might come from the earth, not from heaven. That the cure might lie in something they could touch, not something they could beg. And that was the most frightening thought of all. Because if garlic worked, then maybe the world wasn't cursed. Maybe it was simply dirty, and that was harder to forgive. You can almost hear the world breathing, slow, uneven, and terrified. Every doorway in the city is marked with herbs. Bundles of thyme, sage, and garlic hang like little green crosses, their scent mixing with the rot of rain-soaked earth. Everywhere you go, the same smell, faith and fear in equal measure. The physicians say the air must be purified. They light fires in the streets, toss herbs into the flames, and let the smoke roll through the alleys like incense from a sick cathedral. It helps nothing, but it makes people feel less helpless. And in a time when half the city is coughing blood, feeling less helpless is medicine enough. Inside their homes, families burn vinegar-soaked rags. They seal the windows with wax. They scatter garlic on the floor to trap the disease before it reaches the bed. If you listen closely, you'll hear the soft hiss of prayers being whispered through cloth masks. It's not a ritual, it's a rhythm, the only one left. Even the animals seem afraid. Dogs refuse to enter houses that smell too strongly of the living. Crows gather on church roofs waiting. The air itself feels bruised. In those months, doctors became creatures of habit and smell. Every city had its own recipes for survival. In Paris, they boiled wormwood and lemon peel. In Venice, they filled beak masks with lavender, camphor, and garlic until their faces stung. In London, they simply prayed louder. They wrote elaborate manuals describing how to walk through plague air. Step quickly, they advised, but not so fast as to open the pores. Hold your breath when passing the sick. Never eat fruit that smells sour. Avoid garlic before sermons, lest your breath offend angels. But breathe it deeply before entering a sick room, lest your lungs invite death. Contradiction was not a flaw, it was a way of life. For the churchman, sickness was a conversation between heaven and earth. Plague wasn't random, it was punishment. Bad air was not just bad physics, it was moral rot, made visible. So when people reeked of garlic and vinegar, the clergy warned that even the smell of medicine might anger God. Do not mask the scent of sin, one bishop wrote. Let the air remind you of your guilt. But after a few weeks of funerals, even bishops learned to compromise. They kept their incense burners, swinging a little longer than usual. They washed their hands with holy vinegar. They sprinkled herbs over graves, whispering blessings that sounded suspiciously like recipes. By then, the line between cure and confession had dissolved entirely. Apothecaries made fortunes selling hope in bottles. Distilled courage, they called it. Vinegar mixed with crushed garlic and rosemary sold as both protection and penance. Drink it to cleanse your soul, they said. Rub it on your door to cleanse your home. Hang it above your bed, and perhaps death will mistake you for someone already gone. People did all three. Doctors, meanwhile, measured their worth not in success, but in survival. If they lived through one epidemic, their names became talismans. If they died, their students inherited their masks. No one dared wash them. Washing was believed to spread the disease. So each new physician carried not only the tools of his trade, but the smell of every man who'd worn them before. The scent of garlic, sweat, vinegar, and fear blended into one, the true perfume of medieval medicine. You can imagine the night, the bells tolling endlessly, the candles guttering low. The city turned into a labyrinth of silence. And in the narrow streets, a figure moving slowly through the fog, a doctor wrapped in heavy wool, carrying a small bundle of garlic in his hand. Not because it worked, but because doing something felt safer than doing nothing. He walks past the dying without looking too long. He stops at each door, touches the wood, murmurs a prayer, moves on. His robes smell of sweat and smoke and faint, persistent hope. Above him, the sky hangs low, unwashed, indifferent. The moon glows weakly through the haze, a single pale coin in a currency of sorrow. If he breathes through the cloth long enough, the smell of garlic becomes comfort. It becomes proof he's still alive. In later years, scholars would look back and call it the age of miasma. They'd describe it clinically, like a bad dream explained after waking. They'd talk about the theory of airs, about invisible poisons rising from rot. But for those who lived it, the theory had a heartbeat. They could feel the air pressing against their skin, hear it in the rasp of a loved one's breath. The world wasn't just dangerous, it was contagious, constantly exhaling threats. To live in that world was to breathe carefully. Even the way people spoke changed. Sentences grew shorter, quieter. They talked through fabric, through herbs, through distance. Whole friendships ended because one person coughed too close. The sound of breathing became suspect. And yet through it all, the same strange smell lingered. Garlic, crushed, boiled, burned, eaten, feared. The odor of defiance in a world that could no longer tell faith from infection. You might think the fear would fade when the plague did. It didn't. It just changed costumes. Doctors began carrying pomanders, tiny metal globes filled with scented herbs around their necks. They polished them like relics. They filled them with cloves, cinnamon, and citrus peel, pretending not to notice that the shape of the device was borrowed from a church censer. Even medicine learned to pray. In some places, physicians swore oaths not just to heal, but to keep the air pure. They were required to fast before visiting plague wards, as though empty stomachs could make pure lungs. Some even confessed before each day's rounds, believing that sin itself could spread disease. And still, despite all the incense and theology, the world continued to stink of garlic. By the time the worst of it passed, the survivors carried the smell like a scar. They associated it with the memory of survival and with the cost of it. It clung to the walls, to the straw of beds, to the skin. It became a shorthand for everything the Middle Ages couldn't control. Sickness, fear, defiance, and the desperate need to believe that life could be scrubbed clean. Even centuries later, travelers would write of the smell of old cities, a mix of damp stone, wood smoke, and garlic baked into the mortar of history itself. Because some scents never leave. They just age. And somewhere in that long chain of fear and fumigation, a truth quietly settled into the world's lungs. That faith can cleanse the soul, but it takes garlic to cleanse the air. You can smell the hospital long before you see it. It sits on the edge of the town, a low stone building, half sunk into the earth, the windows covered with rags to keep out the air. Inside, the smell hits like a wall. Vinegar, smoke, garlic, death. A monk is tending the fire, tossing herbs into the smoke the way a priest scatters incense. Each handful flares, then sinks back into the coals with a hiss. The air glows amber and gray, a holy fog that tastes of ash and onions. This is what medicine sounds like here: the crackle of fire, the rasp of lungs, the soft clink of brass bowls being washed in vinegar. Patients line the walls, wrapped in blankets stiff with sweat. Their faces shine with oil, their lips crusted white from fever. A woman hums to her husband the same lullaby she once sang to their child. The doctor moves quietly between them, a candle in one hand, a bundle of herbs in the other. The garlic hangs at his belt like a charm. He kneels beside a young man whose skin is the color of wax. The boy's eyes flicker open. "Will it hurt?" he whispers. The doctor dips a cloth in warm wine, presses it to the boy's forehead. "Only if you breathe," he says gently, and for a moment, they both manage a smile. When the doctor leaves, the monk throws more herbs on the fire. The smoke rises again, thick and sharp. Outside, the church bell begins to toll, not for prayer, but to warn the living. Every hour, carts rattle through the streets, their wheels whispering over cobblestone. Men shout, "Bring out your dead," in voices that have grown hoarse from repetition. People toss rags soaked in vinegar onto the ground, as if the smell could disinfect sorrow. Women lean from windows, waving bundles of garlic like holy water. They whisper Theodore's name without realizing they're doing it. And still the air feels wrong. It's too heavy, too alive, as though every breath might come back poisoned. In the cathedral, the priests are losing patience with mercy. They've been burying more bodies than they bless. The incense can't keep up. The walls sweat from the heat of candles. When the bishop preaches, his voice trembles under the weight of his own fear. He tells his flock that the plague is punishment, a flood of invisible sin washing through the lungs of mankind. But even as he speaks, his acolytes line the altar with garlic. They do it quietly while he isn't looking. At night, when the bells stop and the city falls silent, there's a strange kind of beauty in the emptiness. The moon hangs pale above the rooftops. The fires burn low, turning the streets into corridors of gold and shadow. Every door bears a sign of protection: a cross, a sprig of rosemary, or the familiar braid of garlic. The smell is thick but comforting, like a blanket over the fear. Somewhere, a doctor writes by candlelight, recording what he's seen. He doesn't call it miracle or punishment, only mystery. He dips his quill in ink, pauses, and writes the same sentence you could find in almost every journal of the age. We do not understand it, yet we must keep breathing. He seals the page with wax, presses his signet into it, and sets the parchment aside. Then he crushes one more clove of garlic and drops it into the fire, watching it spark and blacken. Hisses like a secret being told too late. When dawn comes, the fog drifts back in from the river. The city stirs, cautious, half awake. No one opens their shutters too wide. The air still smells faintly of garlic and wet ash. A woman steps out of her house, breathing carefully through a cloth. She looks up at the gray sky and whispers a prayer she learned from her grandmother. May the air be clean. May the breath be kind. It isn't from scripture, but from survival. And it lingers in the morning like incense that refuses to fade. So by the time the last wave of plague passes, the city no longer trusts silence. They keep their fires burning long after the danger is gone. They hang garlic in their windows year-round. The priests bless it now instead of banning it. No one calls it unholy anymore. And though they don't know it, what they've done is something miraculous. They've changed their faith, not replaced it, just shifted it slightly, enough to let the world in. They've learned that salvation can smell strange and that holiness sometimes comes from the dirt. The air will clear, eventually. The fires will go out, but long after the candles have melted and the prayers have quieted, the faint, stubborn scent of garlic will still cling to the stones. A reminder that fear taught humanity to breathe carefully and, in the process, to survive itself. By the time the bells fell silent and the air cleared, the city no longer smelled like death. It smelled like memory, like smoke, vinegar, and garlic ground into the grain of every door. People still burned herbs out of habit, still hung cloves from their rafters, even when no one was coughing anymore. They told themselves it was caution, not fear. But the truth was simpler. They'd grown used to the scent of survival, and yet not everyone smelled the same. Beyond the city walls, the poor still worked in fields heavy with the odor of sweat and soil. But inside the stone manors, behind tapestries that muffled the wind, a different air was rising, one perfumed with rosewater and civet, and very far from the scent of garlic. The age of plague was fading, and a new kind of world was beginning, one where scent no longer warned of death, but whispered of class, where the poor still fought the air, and the rich tried to disguise it. A world that would learn to fear garlic, not for its power, but for its honesty. And so the story drifts upward, from the streets to the palaces, from the healers who smelled of earth to the courtiers who smelled of heaven. The same air, divided by gold and gilt. The same fear, dressed now in silk. It's evening in a medieval city, not in the muddy streets this time, but higher up, where the air smells different. Here, the wind that reaches you has already passed through gardens and courtyards, softened by lavender and roses before it ever touches your face. You're standing outside a nobleman's house. Not a castle exactly. That word implies battles and banners, but a palace, in the small, stubborn way medieval palaces existed. Part fortress, part fantasy, entirely impractical. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's heavy, sweet, expensive, burning beeswax, imported oils, musk, rosewater, a hint of incense stolen from some cathedral, and absolutely no garlic. That smell belongs to the people below. Inside, candles flicker against stone walls, draped with fabric dyed in colors peasants would never even see. The servants move quietly, carrying trays of bread and wine, avoiding the Lord's gaze. Every room hums with the low perfume of money, clean linens, dry wood, polished copper. It smells like safety. But look closer and you'll see the effort it takes to smell this way. Medieval nobles feared stench almost as much as sin. They saw the body's odor as proof of its corruption, and the poor, who lived close to the earth, as walking reminders of mortality. So they built their palaces not to be warm or practical, but to be scented fortresses. Incense burned in every corner. Bowls of dried herbs stood beneath the windows. Perfume wasn't luxury, it was armor. A noble woman's chamber might smell of violet water, rose petals, and civet, a perfume made from the glands of a cat-like animal that cost more than gold. Her bath, if she took one, was steeped in herbs and milk, the scent carefully chosen to disguise the faintest trace of humanity. She didn't want to smell like a body. She wanted to smell like virtue. Meanwhile, in the kitchens below, garlic ruled. The servants chopped it, crushed it, roasted it, and wore it in their skin for the rest of their lives. When they carried food upstairs, the nobles covered their noses with scented handkerchiefs. It wasn't hygiene, it was hierarchy. Garlic became a kind of class marker, the smell of labor, of fields, of everything the rich wanted to forget. If the upper classes could have banned it, they would have. Instead, they simply pretended not to smell it. You can picture a banquet in one of these great halls, long tables groaning under platters of roasted meat and candied fruit, music rising from a corner where a lute player is doing his best not to sneeze in the smoke. The air thick with the scent of wine, beeswax, and perfume. The nobles dine delicately. They take small bites, dabbing their lips with embroidered cloths, smiling through their powdered scents. Their food is flavored not with garlic, but with saffron, cinnamon, sugar, ingredients imported from worlds they'll never see. To eat spices is to eat distance, to taste proof that you are not like everyone else. Meanwhile, the servants watch from the shadows, stomachs growling. When the feast is over, they'll eat the leftovers. The same food, only colder, duller, mixed with garlic to hide the taste of decay. Upstairs, the fragrance of roses. Downstairs, the smell of survival. Even the architecture reflects it. Grand halls with high ceilings and chimneys that carry the air upward, away from the people who matter. Every corridor lined with herbs, as if the house itself is holding its breath. And outside, the city's other smells still waiting. Smoke, sweat, garlic, humanity. Doctors, too, served this divide. When they visited nobles, they wore perfumed gloves, sprinkled their beards with rose water, and chewed cloves to sweeten their breath. They were careful to leave their garlic remedies behind, or at least hide them in silk pouches. No one wanted a healer who smelled like a farmer. It's strange to think about the same plant that once stood between life and death, now unwelcome among the living. In the lower quarters, garlic still hung in doorways as protection. In the upper, it was banned from kitchens entirely. The air had become a new kind of theology. Sweet equals pure, sharp equals profane. Even the church played along. Cathedrals began perfuming their altars with imported incense to mimic the nobility's homes. The smell of sanctity shifted from sweat and smoke to myrrh and rose. The peasants still believed garlic could chase away evil. The bishops believed expensive perfume could chase away sin. Different scents, same superstition. You can imagine the absurdity of it, a world trying to outsmell its own humanity. Women carrying pomanders filled with cloves and ambergris, men dabbing perfume on their gloves before greeting a lady, courtiers comparing the pedigree of their rose water the way knights once compared swords. Even the dead were perfumed before burial, as though the scent of sanctity might distract God from the state of the body. And somewhere in the background, the servants still cooking with garlic, the same way their grandparents did, the same way their children would. Its scent rising through the cracks in the floor, ignored, denied, but never gone. You could scrub the world with rose water, but the smell of life always found a way back in. Perfume became a form of power. If you could afford to smell nothing like the people who worked for you, you could convince yourself you were different from them altogether. The nobles didn't want to be reminded that they were made of the same flesh, the same sweat, the same fragile breath. Garlic ruined the illusion. There's something strangely modern about that. The way scent divides us, even now. The poor smell of work. The rich smell of clean. The difference isn't hygiene. It's privilege disguised as fragrance. Back then, to smell of garlic was to belong to the real world, to the kitchens, the fields, the market stalls. To smell of roses was to live above it, untouched or pretending to be. But even roses rot. Even palaces reek when the wind shifts. If you walk through one of those old halls today, centuries later, the perfumes are long gone. The tapestries have faded. The marble floors still shine, but faintly like old teeth. And yet, if you breathe deep enough beneath the dust and candle wax, you can still catch it. A ghost of garlic somewhere in the mortar. The smell of everything the rich tried to forget, but never could. It's faint, but it's there. Proof that no matter how much rose water the world pours on itself, the truth of where we came from still lingers in the air. You can almost hear the difference between the two worlds. Down below, life hums, blacksmiths pounding, children shouting, the rhythmic scrape of brooms over cobblestone. The air is thick with it. Animal fat, smoke, sour beer, garlic, every sound carries the smell of effort. Up here, in the high quarter, silence is curated. The nobles wake to the rustle of linen and the faint clink of silver. Servants move like ghosts, already burning scented oil before their masters stir. A window is unlatched, just wide enough to let in the illusion of fresh air. You could trace an entire social order by scent. The poor reek because they work. The rich smell sweet because they can afford to do nothing. Take the morning routines. A peasant starts the day with smoke. A hearth to relight, a pot of pottage to stir, bread rubbed with garlic to give it flavor and courage. He eats fast because daylight is rationed. The smoke clings to his hair. The garlic clings to his breath. He smells alive, and it betrays him wherever he goes. In a manner, the day begins with perfume. Rose water poured into a silver basin, a few drops of musk or amber, maybe crushed violet leaves if they can be spared. The Lord dips his hands and face into the water, not to clean, but to sanctify. The scent says what the mirror cannot. I am untouched. He will not eat garlic. He will not even touch onions. He prefers soft bread and figs, his food scented with sugar and wine. When he walks through town, people can smell the difference before they see it. His fragrance precedes him like a title. Even physicians catering to the wealthy learn to tailor their smells. The remedies for nobles came wrapped in linen, soaked with rose water. The same medicine for a commoner came unwrapped, smelling of vinegar and garlic. It wasn't about health, it was about class compatibility. The same contrast extended to cleanliness. For the poor, water was a tool, fetched, carried, shared, reused. Bathing was practical, rare, and public. The scent of labor lingered, no matter how hard they scrubbed. For the rich, bathing was ceremony. Servants heated water with herbs, sage, chamomile, mint, and filled wooden tubs with petals and oils. Nobles sat in it like saints in reliquaries, soaking not to remove dirt, but to collect scent. The water left their skins slick with perfume, and their souls reassured. And yet, beneath it all, the same rules of survival applied. The perfumed noble still feared foul air. The peasant still feared hunger. Both hung charms near their beds, one made of silk and myrrh, the other of garlic and prayer. Even love carried a smell. A peasant's courting gift might be a braid of garlic, practical, enduring, a quiet promise that the house would stay fed and safe. A noble's gift was perfume in a glass vial, imported from Venice or Damascus, fragile and impossible to refill. Both were declarations of devotion, but one could survive a winter and the other couldn't survive a fall. There's something beautiful in that, and something sad. The poor lived close to the world's heartbeat. The rich lived above it, listening through scented veils. Neither could escape what they feared, only disguise it. By the late Middle Ages, the obsession reached absurd heights. In France and Italy, perfumed gloves became fashionable. The scent was meant to purify the air before it touched your skin. Some nobles wore pomanders the size of apples, stuffed with cloves, amber, and musk, dangling from golden chains. Others lined their sleeves with herbs, as if virtue could be worn like fabric. The more the world stank, the stronger the perfumes became. Doctors warned against it. Perfume closes the pores, they said, and traps disease inside. The nobles ignored them. Better to risk fever than smell like a peasant. Meanwhile, garlic remained in the alleys, chopped into stews, crushed into poultices, smeared on bread and skin alike. It was the poor man's medicine, the poor woman's spice, the flavor of endurance. If the rich smelled like roses, the poor smelled like the earth. And between those two scents lay the entire Middle Ages. When travelers from the East or from peasant villages visited noble courts, they were immediately noticed, not for their clothes or speech, but for their smell. Courtiers whispered behind fans. Servants whispered behind doors. Some even carried sprigs of mint to their noses as they passed, a silent insult disguised as etiquette. One chronicler recorded a visiting envoy from the countryside being given a bath before his audience with the king. Not out of kindness, out of necessity. He carried the odor of garlic, the note read, which offends the delicate air of the court. The irony, of course, was that the envoy lived longer than half the courtiers he met. Garlic kept him healthy. Rosewater did not, but longevity was never fashionable. Even the architecture began to reflect this division. In peasant homes, kitchens were the center. The fire, the smell, the life. In noble houses, kitchens were buried far away, often at the base of a separate tower, where the scent of food could not climb the stairs. Meals were carried through long corridors to arrive on perfumed plates. The guests smelled nothing of the hands that fed them. The world above forgot the world below. But the smell of garlic was stubborn. It clung to the hands of servants, the hair of cooks, the breath of anyone honest. No matter how high the perfumed palaces rose, the scent of reality still crept in through the cracks. When the Renaissance arrived, bringing with it baths of marble and perfumes of philosophy, garlic was already ancient, a survivor of plagues, wars, and sermons. The elite called it vulgar. The poor called it supper. And still, it grew in every garden, free and unrepentant. It outlasted kings, fashions, and even the fragrances that once tried to drown it. If you crushed it between your fingers, it still smelled the same. Sharp, human, alive. No hierarchy could change that. Because garlic, like truth, doesn't wash off easily. You can follow the scent trail straight through the centuries. Garlic rising from the kitchens, roses drifting down from the upper floors. They met somewhere in the middle, where the servants carried trays between worlds, breathing in both airs at once. Those servants became the silent historians of smell. They learned which corridors always stank of candle smoke, which lords demanded orange peel rubbed along the banisters, which ladies fainted at the first hint of the kitchen's breath. They didn't have titles, but they held the secret geography of scent, where the world of labor brushed against the world of leisure. Imagine one of them, a woman perhaps, in her 30s, hands raw from scouring copper pots. She smells perpetually of garlic and smoke, and no matter how many times she scrubs, the scent stays. Her mistress complains that the odor clings to the linen, so she's ordered to wash her hands in wine and lemon after every meal. It burns the skin, but changes nothing. The next night, she's back in the kitchen, chopping cloves for the stew, feeding the house that pretends she doesn't exist. Garlic becomes her inheritance, her invisible badge. It follows her out into the street, where the other servants gather at dusk, their laughter as sharp as the smell on their breath. They joke that one day the nobles will learn the truth, that garlic is the smell of people who actually eat what they cook. Upstairs, life continues in scented stillness. Noble women sit in candlelight, while attendants brush rose oil through their hair. They gossip about the newest fragrance from Venice, ambergris. They say, harvested from the belly of whales, as if luxury itself must come from the strangest places. They dab the oil behind their ears, on their wrists, beneath their collars. Every movement leaves a trail. The air around them feels heavy, expensive, detached from the world outside. They speak of purity, of virtue, of refinement, words that always mean distance. Garlic belongs to kitchens, and kitchens belong to servants, and servants are invisible. It's a tidy system until the plague returns, and no amount of perfume can hide the truth that everyone breathes the same air. When death comes back to the palaces, it smells familiar. Not like roses, not like incense. It smells like the city again, sharp, earthy, undeniable. The rich always tried to separate themselves from it. But scent is democratic. It seeps through walls, climbs staircases, hides in the seams of silk. You can pretend you don't share a world with those below you, but eventually, the air reminds you. It's not that the nobles didn't understand the value of garlic. They simply couldn't afford to admit it. To acknowledge its power was to acknowledge the wisdom of the poor, and that was harder to swallow than the smell itself. So they redefined virtue through fragrance. They said holiness smelled like lilies, nobility like musk, beauty like violets. Garlic, therefore, became the scent of everything undesirable: hunger, sweat, and honesty. By the 15th century, the fashion for perfume had become a ritual of identity. Men carried sachets, filled with crushed herbs beneath their armor. Women kept perfumed beeswax tablets in their sleeves. Even letters were scented, sealed with a whiff of amber or rose oil, so that affection arrived pre-approved by the nose. If you were poor, you couldn't afford any of this. Your signature scent was work. Garlic, wood smoke, wet wool, and bread. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. The smell of the body, doing what bodies must do to keep living. And in this divide, the irony deepened. The nobles spent fortunes trying to imitate paradise. But the closer they got to it, the less human they became. Their perfumes masked not just odor, but connection. They could no longer smell their food, their servants, or the earth beneath their gardens. They lived in a kind of scented exile, surrounded by luxury and longing for air that didn't taste of themselves. The poor, meanwhile, carried the same scent everywhere. When they went to church, the garlic followed. When they knelt in prayer, it rose with them, like a ghost of survival drifting heavenward. Maybe that's why priests kept burning incense to even the balance, to make sure heaven didn't smell too much like earth. By the dawn of the Renaissance, perfume had become theology with better packaging. It promised purification, status, and safety, a trinity in a vial. And yet, even the perfumers knew their trade depended on contradiction. They distilled their oils in boiling pots, mixed them with animal fat, and masked the scent of decay with sweetness. Behind every fragrance was a factory of rot. Behind every rosewater bath was a peasant hauling buckets from a river that smelled of life's leftovers. Garlic, meanwhile, stayed simple. It didn't pretend. It didn't aspire to holiness. It simply grew through wars, famines, crusades, and epidemics, a reminder that the earth doesn't care for class. It's strange to think that a single plant could define the boundaries of a world. Garlic for the poor, perfume for the rich. And yet, both were responses to the same fear, the same invisible danger floating through the air. The difference was only in the price of the disguise. When the nobles pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses and the peasants pressed garlic to their mouths, both were doing the same thing, trying to breathe without dying. If you walk through the ruins of an old palace now, you can still smell it faintly. Centuries of incense and polish, beeswax and dust. It's elegant, empty, and dry. But open the door to what used to be the kitchen, and another scent waits, deeper, heavier, alive. The walls remember it. The stones remember it. Garlic, smoke, and time, two worlds, one building. Two airs, one breath. No matter how much perfume the nobility poured over themselves, they never managed to erase the truth that kept rising from below, that every sweet smell in history is built on the shoulders of something that stank. By the time the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the air itself seemed to have chosen sides. In the streets below, it smelled of wood smoke, garlic, and work, the old perfume of the living. In the palaces above, it floated through tapestries and marble halls perfumed with roses and musk, the new fragrance of distance. The line between the two was thin but unyielding, like the seam of a wall where the scent of stew can never quite be scrubbed out. The poor carried garlic in their hands. The rich carried roses in theirs. Both claimed they were chasing purity, and both were right in their own way. But the world was changing again. The scent of incense in churches began to mix with something sharper, the early smoke of reason, the faint beginning of science. Soon, the learned would write of air and infection, of herbs and humors, of the fragile truth that floated between faith and fear. And somewhere, beneath the perfumes and prayers that stubborn, simple smell endured, garlic, unchanged, unrefined, and somehow still sacred. It had outlasted famine, plague, bishops, and kings. It would outlast palaces too, because in the end, every breath, sweet or foul, belongs to the same world, the same body, the same fragile act of staying alive. And as the candles burn lower, the story drifts downward again, away from the perfumed halls, back to the quiet earth where things grow, rot, and heal in their own time. The world has grown quiet now. Centuries have settled like dust, soft and forgiving. The streets that once echoed with coughing and prayer are still there, but they breathe more slowly now. Their stones have absorbed everything, the footsteps, the fire, the fear, and hold it quietly the way old walls do. If you listen long enough, you can still hear the rhythm of the past. Not the noise of battles or bells, but the smaller sounds that truly built history. The scrape of a spoon in a wooden bowl, the hush of a candle being snuffed, the rustle of straw in a doctor's bag, and beneath it all, the faint familiar breath of something simple, garlic, the humblest scent to ever survive an empire. You can trace human history through smells more easily than through kings. Incense and sweat, smoke and soap, garlic and rosewater. Each age carried its own perfume of belief. The Middle Ages believed that scent could save or damn you. Odor was evidence. A sweet smell meant grace, a foul one, guilt. A perfumed saint was proof of holiness, and a reeking sinner proof of decay. The logic was flawed, but the instinct was timeless. We've always tried to make the air behave. Today, we call it hygiene, deodorant, cleanliness. Back then, it was salvation, or the hope of it. Either way, we've never stopped fighting the air. The story of garlic is really the story of everything we tried to understand before science came to name it. It grew wild, uninvited, and people noticed what it did. They saw wounds heal faster, coughs ease, fevers break. They didn't know why, so they gave it meaning instead. They said it was powerful. They said it was dangerous. They said it could drive away both demons and friends. And in that contradiction lies the essence of humanity, the need to turn mystery into myth and myth into medicine. When a medieval doctor crushed a clove between his fingers, he wasn't performing witchcraft or chemistry. He was performing hope. He was saying, I don't understand this world, but I'll try anyway. Centuries later, we call that bravery science. But it's the same impulse that built shrines, lit candles, whispered prayers. The same instinct that made someone hang garlic over their doorway and call it protection. Different words, same heart. If you peel away the layers of history, you'll find the same story repeated again and again, people trying to make sense of the invisible. Whether it's bad air, bacteria, or destiny, the fear feels identical. And so does the remedy. A ritual, a scent, a habit that says, I'm still here. You can imagine the last of the medieval physicians fading into old age. He sits in a chair near the fire, his hands spotted and trembling, his robe smelling faintly of herbs. He's seen too much, too many fevers, too many funerals, but he still crushes garlic into his broth every morning. Not because he thinks it will save him, but because it reminds him that life is still within reach. He thinks of his patients, the ones who lived and the ones who didn't, and he wonders which were healed by medicine and which by mercy. He stopped trying to tell the difference. Maybe they were the same thing. When he breathes in the scent, it takes him back to the hospital by the river, the candles, the prayers, the trembling hands holding his. The smell is sharp but kind, like memory that still aches but no longer wounds. History likes to tell stories of progress as straight lines, ignorance giving way to knowledge, fear to enlightenment. But human beings don't move in straight lines. We circle the same fires over and over, just under different names. The medievals burned herbs to cleanse the air. We sterilize our world with chemicals. They feared bad smells. We fear invisible germs. They covered their faces with masks of leather and linen. We wear fabric ones of cotton and synthetic fiber. We think ourselves advanced, and we are, but we are also familiar. Progress is only repetition, with better lighting. You can still find garlic braided and hung over doorways in rural Europe. Most people say it's for cooking, but they hang it near the threshold, not the pantry. They touch it when leaving the house, without quite knowing why. It's a reflex buried in generations of superstition. Touch the cloves, whisper a blessing, keep the air kind. Old instincts survive in quiet ways. A hand washing more often than needed. A window opened for fresh air even on cold days. A candle lit for ambiance that still feels vaguely like protection. We think we've left the Middle Ages behind, but every time we crave cleanliness or fear breath or reach for something that smells safe, we're breathing their same thoughts, just with less Latin. The line between medicine and faith has always been more of a fragrance than a border. It drifts. Sometimes science smells like incense, sometimes prayer smells like antiseptic. When Louis Pasteur bent over his microscope, discovering what medieval doctors could never see, perhaps the room smelled faintly of garlic from the laboratory kitchen. Perhaps in that moment the ghosts of Salerno smiled. It's comforting to imagine that knowledge doesn't replace faith. It just learns to speak its language more clearly. Think of all the small rituals we perform without thinking. A deep breath before bad news. A candle lit before dinner. Soap lathered into the palms. And sinds is ever to duppa wepsnumil where wender one hot. And when they're regained to 80, but that wenner the brie, for a wenner the bevered of the 80 every gudna full ever too. Air fresheners sprayed before guests arrive. We are still shaping the world by scent, still trying to convince ourselves that good smells mean safety. If a medieval physician could see us now, our sterile corridors, our gleaming clinics, he would recognize the impulse immediately. He would only wonder why, with so much certainty, we still look so anxious. Maybe that's because no matter how much we sanitize, we can't disinfect fear. It's part of the human condition, and it has its own smell. Faintly metallic, a little like garlic. When you walk through an old church, you smell time. Beeswax and stone, dust and incense, the faint trace of centuries breathing the same air. When you walk into a kitchen, you smell life. Oil, bread, heat, garlic, the things that remind you the world is still feeding itself. The two scents are not so different. One nourishes the soul, the other the body. Both require faith, and maybe that's why garlic feels eternal, because it sits right between holiness and hunger, between heaven and hearth. It belongs to everyone. Theodore of Salerno would have understood this. He'd look at our pharmacies, our antibiotics, our antiseptics, and he'd smile, faintly, the way only someone who has lived through centuries of misunderstanding could. He'd recognize the logic, but also the superstition beneath it. He'd see how we still worship the invisible. Only now we call it science instead of spirit. And maybe he'd whisper the same advice he once wrote in the margin of his notes. Allium fortem est. Garlic is strong. Not because it heals everything, but because it reminds us that the simplest things often matter the most. When you crush a clove now, centuries later, it makes the same sound it made in 1347, that small, wet crack between fingers, the release of scent into the air. For a second, time folds. The kitchen becomes a medieval apothecary. The light from your window becomes candlelight flickering on stone. The smell fills the room, sharp, honest, ancient. It is both memory and moment, both survival and supper. It asks for nothing except to be noticed. If you close your eyes while that scent drifts upward, you can see them all. The peasants stooping over their gardens, the doctors in masks walking through mist. The nobles behind silk curtains, pretending the world outside isn't burning. And in the middle of it all, the same fragile miracle of breath, the quiet, rhythmic proof that we exist at all. Breathing is the oldest prayer. Garlic is just its fragrance. We like to believe that history has left behind its fears, that we live in cleaner air now, untouched by ignorance. But every generation inherits the same question. How do we live with what we cannot see? The medievals answered with herbs and hymns. We answer with data and design. But at the heart of it, We're all doing the same thing, fumbling toward safety, toward meaning, toward a reason to believe that the air will be kind tomorrow. And maybe that's enough. Maybe wisdom isn't certainty. Maybe it's simply knowing that fear can be lived with, as long as we keep breathing through it. Garlic endures because it never asked to be perfect. It stinks. It clings. It bruises easily. But it also feeds, cleanses, and heals. It embodies the awkward grace of being human. Useful, flawed, and impossible to ignore. For all our perfumes and progress, we are still drawn to that honesty. The reminder that purity isn't sweet. That life, at its truest, has an edge. That survival has a smell. So tonight, as you drift between wakefulness and sleep, imagine the world exhaling. The torches of the past dimming into quiet embers. The cities breathing softly again. The old doctors setting down their tools, their robes still carrying the faint scent of garlic and smoke. The nobles asleep in their perfumed chambers, the servants sneaking bites from the kitchen pot. The air, for once calm. And you here, centuries away, breathing the same invisible thread that ties them all together. The air is the same. The fear is softer now. The scent, eternal. Because somewhere in every breath we take, a trace of the past remains. A molecule of air from a medieval hospital. And a whisper from Theodore's garden. A note of smoke from a plague fire. A molecule of someone's prayer. And maybe that's what comfort really is. The knowledge that even the worst centuries left something tender behind. We survived them. They taught us how. So let the story fade now, the way smoke thins at dawn. Let the air settle. Let the garlic scent linger just long enough to remind you that life in all its mess, its odor, its imperfection is still here, still breathing, still human. And if you're still awake, that's fine. Stay with it a moment longer. Feel the rhythm of your own breath matching theirs, separated by centuries, but not by meaning. Because in the end, history doesn't sleep. It exhales. And the air it leaves behind is ours to keep.